So we're covering all of Exodus through Deuteronomy today. So let's start out with a timeline. Creation, flood, Tower of Babel symbols there on the timeline. And then after that comes Abraham. And then by the end of Genesis, the family of Abraham is in Egypt. So if you have big blank box there, you can put Egypt.
In the first one?
In the first rectangle, yes. And they're there from roughly 1800 to 1400. So about 400 years. So the first rectangle on the left side.
Is that the ones that's laying down or the ones that's standing vertical? Up and down.
The big square, sorry. I should see. Yes, the very first box is Egypt. You could put slavery in there. And then after Egypt, it's Moses who leads them out. So in between the two boxes, you could write Moses. You'll have to write it sideways probably. Unless you can write very small. And then Moses becomes the first judge. So the next box is the judges. So they were in Egypt for roughly 400 years, and they are in the land under the leadership of judges as a tribal confederacy for about 400 years. And who's the last judge? Anyone know?
Samuel.
That's right, Samuel. So around 1000, I'm using rough dates here, you have Samuel, who's the last judge, and he anoints the first two kings. And the kings, the monarchy box is a strange shape. It's like a wishbone shape because, why is it a wishbone shape? Because the kingdom divides after 120 years. They really only have Saul, David, and Solomon under the united monarchy, and then it divides into Israel and Judah. Israel in the north, Judah in the south. Judah lasts a little longer because they have a few good kings. Israel has 0 good kings. And then the red box is what? What ends the kingdom? Exile. Exile is arguably the most significant event in the Old Testament. It's not, but it's arguably that. We'll talk about that later. But that's a huge deal. And most of the Old Testament came together revolving around the exile. And the Jews trying to maintain their national identity with no national land. And in the post-exile, they get to come back to the land. And many of the books of the Old Testament were brought together under the leadership of Ezra and others. And then you have 400 years after the Old Testament closes. You have 400 years till Jesus. So, up above that, the first 12 books of the Bible tell one continuous story. If you just pick up a Bible and start reading, it will tell one story up to the end of 2 Kings. And then when you start 1 Chronicles, you go, wait a minute. This is going back and recovering some information. But then 2 Chronicles, after you read through the Chronicles, it tells about the king period, the monarchy period again, but this time it goes a little further all the way into the post-exile. So the first 14 books tell the whole story of the Old Testament, with a little duplication between Kings and Chronicles. So each book of the story, each book of the Bible, assumes the reader has read the preceding ones. So to say that because the biblical books are by different authors, written at different times and different centuries, they don't have cohesion, is to misread them. That's the second one.
What is the second one? I'm sorry.
Assumes.
Jacob, what was the dotted line rectangular there? After
Post-exile.
Post-exile.
Or you could write return if you want.
Return.
In the black dotted one?
Yeah, the dashed box, yes. Okay, and it is the story of the Old Testament takes place over the course of millennia. It's a huge story with an amazing amount of cohesion. So, remember, I left a little space under that. Remember that there is a difference between when a book takes place and when it was written. Because Kings and Chronicles take place at the same time. That's why books 13 and 14 seem like a reduplication, but they were written at different times. Kings was written during the exile. All you have to do is look at the end of the book to see. And it says, and then we went into exile, and that's where we are still today. So you can tell when it was written. And it's written to show this is why we're here, people. We blew it. Look at our history. We were terrible. It was there to explain the situation. But then Chronicles, they're back now. And Chronicles covers the same material, but this time emphasizes God's grace. And so it has a different slant. Everything looks better. And Chronicles is saying, hey, we blew it, but God's giving us a second chance. So it emphasizes different things. Okay, so can anyone tell us where the books we're covering today take place on the timeline? I left a little space below for you to fill that in. Where do Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy take place on the timeline? You could write it down below.
Right around Moses' time, 1400.
Yeah, so Genesis starts way at the beginning, leading up to Egypt. And then Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy all take place in Moses' lifetime. So you probably just want to write the first letter there because there's not a lot of space for that. But don't worry, we're going to have a timeline that zooms in on that era down below. But we don't have to look at that yet. Okay, so the big event here is the Exodus. And the key player in the Exodus story in all these books is Moses. Moses wrote those first 5 books. And the next blank is these 5 books are called the what?
Pentateuch.
Often called the Pentateuch, yeah, but we're looking for the word Torah here, which means law or instruction. So in the New Testament, they'll say the law and the prophets, meaning the book. Torah, Torah.
Torah. I can't believe I spelled it right.
So you'll see in the New Testament, it'll say the law and the prophets, meaning the books of Moses and everybody else, the whole Old Testament. Sometimes the law, the prophets, and the writings. I think Luke says the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. Other ways to, but the main first building block of the Bible is the Torah. Okay, now Moses' birth and death bookend Exodus through Deuteronomy. Those 4 books, which all take place in the same era during Moses' lifetime, start with Moses' birth and end with Moses' death.
Is this on the question of why do you suppose the second book?
No, it's under Moses blank bookends the books of Exodus through Deuteronomy. Birth and death. So, why do you suppose the second book of the Bible is called Exodus? Yes, there is a mass exodus of Egypt. That's right. So, because there's not much space on the timeline above, for all the events that happened during Moses' lifetime. We've got a zoomed in version. So does everyone understand how that timeline at the bottom fits into the timeline at the top? There's a little section above that says Moses. You should have written in Moses between Egypt and Judges.
Yeah.
Now we're zooming into Moses' lifetime.
So is the 40 like,
Moses lives 120 years, and his life is divided into 3 periods of 40 years. Now, as you can see based on the size of those boxes, the timeline's not exactly to scale because it wouldn't fit on the page if it were. But Moses' first 40 years of life after his birth are spent where? In Egypt. Yes, as part of the royal family.
on
So
that line, do we write Egypt or do we write, this is his first 40 years?
the line down below, you write Moses' birth. To the bottom left. So he's born there, and then he spends 40 years in Egypt. And then after 40 years, he decides to side with his Hebrew brethren. Not in the best way, through murder. And then, of course, after killing someone, and finding out people know about it, he has to flee. And then he spends 40 years where?
Midian.
Yeah, in Midian, where he gets a wife and a son and a family and a job, and spends 40 years shepherding. This may have been good for his humility. People who are raised as members of a royal household typically don't have a great attitude. If they see something they don't like, they can just put a stop to it. That's what he does. He just kills the guy.
And who was the guy he killed?
It was an Egyptian guy who was beating a Hebrew guy, and he just kills him and hides him in the sand.
But he was seen.
Oh, I got that wrong. I thought it was 2 Jewish brethren.
That happens later,
Okay.
and he tries to stop him, and they're like, oh, what are you going to do, kill me like you killed the Egyptian? And then he's like, oh, people know about this. I better get out of here. So he flees. Yeah, so 40 years there. So he starts his ministry really when he's 80. So that's when the burning bush takes place, and God speaks to him at the age of 80, and then he goes back to Egypt to tell Pharaoh to let his people go, probably someone he grew up with. And Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and so there are 10 plagues. God sends 10 plagues. We're going to talk about the plagues later, but does anyone not know? Is anyone like, what do you mean by plagues? Like diseases? No. Terrible things that happen to Egypt because God says, I want you, through Moses, I want you to let the Jews go. And Pharaoh says no. And God says, okay, well, I'm going to do this. And he does a terrible thing. And then Pharaoh says no. Still another terrible thing. 10 of them happen. The nation is ravished, destroyed. And finally he lets them go and then changes his mind again and chases them, and the Red Sea parts. Famous, yes, familiar with the Red Sea parting? Yes. Now, in the movie Bruce Almighty, the Red Sea is a bowl of tomato soup that parts.
Yeah.
But it was much bigger than that. It's just a Hollywood movie that references the Red Sea. Okay, and then, so plagues and Red Sea, all in the same dash. I mean, that's all one series of events, those 11 events. Then the next mark on the timeline is Massa and Meribah. You can just write M and M.
Is that on the top?
It is. So the first line on the top, plagues and Red Sea. I'm sorry if you thought the second one was the Red Sea. And then the next event, you can just write M and M. for Massa and Meribah, which we'll cover.
Oh,
Yeah, we'll cover that in detail later. And then the line down below, the key event here is Mount Sinai. What happens at Mount Sinai?
Just the one below.
That's the one below. Yeah, he gets the Ten Commandments and a lot more. A lot of things happen. And then,
On this
at the end, they're still there.
one. Oh, no, on this one, sorry.
The fourth and final line in between the two boxes of 40 is the spies. They send out the spies. And
Is that the long 40?
it's just the dash before the 40. There
Oh,
should be a blank there.
I guess that's good. And what is it?
I should have written these out like this. Lesson learned for tonight's class. Okay? The plagues and Red Sea, Massa and Meribah, Sinai, spies. Okay, then there's 40 years of wandering as punishment for the spies episode. And then at the end of that period, there is Sihon and Og. So those are great names. I'm not sure on the spelling. But they basically defeat two nations in Moab's region. And then Moses dies. That's the last one. So you can see all four of these books, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, are all start and end with the birth and death of Moses. So he's the key player. Any questions about that chart? There were obviously lots of confusion with the lines and whatnot. But those are the key events that we're going to cover in the next hour. So if you're confused about it, now will be the time to say, who's Og? He was a king they defeated. Okay, but let's go back, page 2, and let's look at the plagues. Let's see. Natalie, could you read the plague of the blood? This is the first plague.
And the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is unyielding. He refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning as he goes out to the river. Confront him on the bank of the Nile and take your hand the staff that was changed into a snake. Then say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has sent me to say to you, let my people go so that they may worship me in the wilderness. But until now you have not listened. This is what the Lord says. By this you will know that I am the Lord. With the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water of the Nile, and it will be changed into blood. The fish in the Nile will die, and the river will stink. The Egyptians will not be able to drink its water. But the Egyptian magicians did the same things by their secret arts, and Pharaoh's heart became hard. He would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said.
Okay, so the Nile is exceedingly important to the nation of Israel. That is impossible to overstate. Has anyone ever seen a modern day map or globe of the nation of Israel? The nation of Egypt. I'll show you what it looks like. If you were to look at a map, it would look like this. This is the Nile River. There's the Sinai Peninsula. Okay? This is what it would look like. Maps, they tend to make nations different colors. Okay? So it'll look like, I don't know where the border is on this area, but it'll look like this. And this will be the nation, the modern day nation state of Egypt. Yes? Familiar with that? Well, guess what? Nobody lives here in the desert. Nobody lives here in the desert. Back then and today, all of life, especially in the ancient world, all of life is within 1 mile of the Nile River on either side. That's the nation. This, yeah, they own this land. They can test their bombs out there, but that's about it. The Nile is like a thin swath of life through an endless amount of death and nothing. There's not even much sand. It's just dry, cracked earth, the majority of the Sahara Desert. So this is where the nation is. So, striking the Nile, turning it to blood, is a huge deal. But the magicians do the same thing by their secret arts. Now, as to whether those are illusions, like deception, the way magicians in our culture are, or whether those are actually occult practices that they can actually do supernatural actions, is not stated.
Paul had a question.
Oh, sorry. I was just wondering, where is is Nile one of those that flows from south to north?
Yeah.
The delta is up there.
Yes,
That's
whereas,
the Nile Delta.
yep. So Upper and Lower Egypt, because
That's the
this is
Mediterranean Sea up there?
this is the Mediterranean Sea, this is the Red Sea.
Okay.
Yes.
So a portion of it was turned to blood, because how could you tell that the magicians turned it to blood if it was already turned to blood?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I presume that they had water that they changed to blood.
In a tubs or
Yeah, they were able to get water by digging near the Nile. So, in order to not have everyone die, it kind of ruins the story. God's goal here is to display his power and other things. And so, if he just turns all the water to blood, even the water you dig to near the Nile, then everyone would die before the story ends. So, if they dig near the Nile, down to where you get water, it was actually water. So apparently that's what they did. And then they said, watch, we can do it too. So, one presumes that they were actually doing this. It's more likely that they were actually doing it somehow through whatever occult practices they may have had. Okay, the next one. Sue, could you read the frog's plague?
Yes. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Tell Aaron, stretch out your hand with your staff over the streams and canals and ponds, and make frogs come up on the land of Egypt." So Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the land. But the magicians did the same things by their secret arts. They also made frogs come up on the land of Egypt.
Okay, so again, you get a repetition of that
What was the purpose for them imitating?
to show that we can do it too. You're not that great. Your God's not that great, Moses. We can do it too. Now, yeah, we'll come to that.
Does each one of them pertain to a god in Egypt?
Well, yeah, we'll come to that in a moment.
Okay.
But let's look at the next plague that happens. Pharaoh's heart is still hard, and then he sends gnats. Let's see, Darla, could you read the section on the gnats plague?
Then the Lord said to Moses, "Tell Aaron, stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the ground. And throughout the land of Egypt, the dust becomes gnats." They did this, and when Aaron stretched out his hand with the staff and struck the dust of the ground, gnats came on people and animals. All the dust throughout the land of Egypt became gnats. But when the magicians tried to produce gnats by their secret arts, they could not do it. Since the gnats were on people and animals everywhere, the magician said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh's heart still was hard, and he would not listen, just as the Lord said.
And then you can see listed the next 7 plagues there. But this is an important moment in the story, because God's purpose for doing these plagues was to display his power, his glory, his dominance over anybody and anything else. So, when the magicians say, "This is the finger of God," this is... Now, whether they had a concept of a monotheistic God or not seems unlikely. But they said, this is something from the divine up there. Whatever the Hebrew God is, whatever, this is from him.
These plagues didn't affect the Israelites?
Some of them did, yes. There's careful mention when God starts making a distinction. And it's important, that concept of just, I'll send all these plagues on the Egyptians, but not on the city of Goshen where the Jews live, the land of Goshen. That distinction is really building towards the big distinction of the last plague, when it has to do with, I'm going to send the death angel through, and if anybody has blood on their door, it'll pass over them. So that distinction really is anyone who puts the blood on their door. It generally happened to be the Jews. But any Egyptian who's like, you know what, I'm going to do what these Jews are doing because their God is really way more powerful than my God.
So God took care of the Egyptians too?
If they put the blood on their door, any house that had the blood on their door, now if they were like those crazy Jews who spreading blood on their door, it would be hard to imagine someone thinking that. But yeah, and any Jews who are like, I don't need to do this. I'm good. The last 5 plagues didn't affect me, so then they died. So now, I've heard lots of things about how each of the plagues targets a specific one of the Egyptian gods. I think that's probably true. I've spent a lot of time trying to verify that. I think that's probably true, especially because just from what I know of Egyptian culture, it seems very much like they do correspond with some of their gods. So God's displaying his dominance over these other gods. However, that's not what the text emphasizes. The text emphasizes the magicians, the court, dark arts people.
How did they do that? How did they reproduce themselves?
Well, like I said, it was either an illusion, it was a trick, or through occult practices, through witchcraft and sorcery, they were actually doing it. Now, what's important here is to know that while the official religion had all these gods, like Ra, the sun god, so that darkness would potentially show that Yahweh is more powerful than Ra. But along with that, this whole religion was deeply not the same thing as, but used along with witchcraft and sorcery and the occult, especially among the common people. So just think about people who were communing with the dead through mediums and casting spells and thinking about demons and warding off and all those kinds of things. That was commonplace in the nation of Egypt and in Canaan. And that's why God forbids it in the law that Moses is going to write here shortly. But at this point, he hasn't written it yet. But what the text primarily emphasizes is not just God's dominance over their gods, but over their religious practices.
Why couldn't the people see the difference between what the magicians were doing and what God was doing? Because God was doing it out of speaking. They could see the magicians digging holes, digging up the water. Why couldn't they tell the difference?
You mean God's was more powerful?
Right.
Because it was on a larger scale? I mean, I guess once God turned the river to blood, there was no other river for them to turn to blood of equal magnitude. But they could still turn water to blood.
What, we're digging down?
A bucket of water.
Well, they had to get some water to turn it into blood. I mean, imagine this happens, and Pharaoh's like, talks to his courtiers, some of whom are sorcerers and spiritists and mediums and all these occult practices, and some of whom are priests to their different gods. He says, this Yahweh Hebrew God, whatever his name is, he just turned the whole river into blood. Is that like more than what you can do? Is their God more powerful? And they're like, oh, we can turn water to blood too. Give me some water, I'll turn it into blood. Well, they don't have a huge, vast quantity of water to get, but they get some water. It doesn't say how much. And it's like, watch. Whatever they do turns to blood. Whether it was a trick or not is not the emphasis. The emphasis is that as the plagues go, pretty soon they're like, we can't do this. This is not just a spell that he's waving his staff over the river. This is the finger of God coming down. So if they thought of the world as this is the land and there's a huge dome over us, right? It has the stars and the clouds and all that in it. Obviously we think of it in a much more scientific way, but that's not necessarily a better way to think of it. But anyway, there's this huge dome over us, and up above that are the gods. And it looks like one of the gods, or maybe the most powerful god, or somebody up there, opened the dome and reached his finger down. It would be a very long finger of a god. And he's doing something to us. So we should probably just do what he says. But Pharaoh's heart is hard again. Okay, now, why do you suppose there is such an astonishing display of power after 400 years of nothing? 4 centuries. George Washington was less than 3 centuries ago from us. A long, long time of nothing from God. And then all of a sudden...
Well, I imagine his people had stopped believing in him.
The people had, so Joseph's children and their children had stopped believing in God, you think?
Well,
Turned to
or
idolatry, maybe.
else, just thought he wasn't there, or he wasn't going to show up, or he wasn't going to do anything. After 400 years, that's a long time.
Well,
God
but
finally had a man who was humble enough to use.
because, okay, so we've got, they didn't believe, although the problem with saying God's not speaking or doing anything while they're enslaved at the very least 80 years from Moses' birth, that's happening. It's a couple generations there. But maybe, longer. The problem with saying God's not doing anything because nobody believes, well, they still don't believe. So why would all of a sudden? And Darla is saying because God finally has a man humble enough. That's conceivable.
Well, it only took 40 years of them in the wilderness with God doing miracles for them every day. That they rejected, or I won't say didn't believe, but they complained and mumbled.
Yeah, Massa and Meribah, yeah. We're going to get to that.
Well, look what's going on in the world today, and God is quiet.
Oh, okay, so yeah. So yeah, that's a good parallel with us. Right now, God is quiet. And someday, whenever that is, there will suddenly be astonishing divine activity again. However,
God was letting the tribe of Israel grow in number so that they could be a nation.
okay. Yes.
How many people was it? About a million?
A million or two, yeah, by this point. But the surprising thing is that the Bible doesn't tell us why God is silent during those 400 years. It tells us why they're in Egypt for 400 years, because he is allowing the nations of Canaan to reach their zenith of wickedness, so that when the Jews come in and kill them, it'll be just.
Well, there's another 400-year period. So it seems like it's 400 years here, and then there's 400 years at the end before Christ comes.
Well, yes, there's 1, 2, 3. There's 4 400-year periods in the Old Testament, and 200-year periods. But the question of why he's silent for so long and then appears gloriously isn't really answered at all. So the answer is just that it's in God's sovereign timing.
Don't you think during that time there were people that were still faithful to God?
I do, because it seems like some of them knew something. They had heard at least about that their ancestor Abraham had a God that appeared to him. However, they had forgotten his name, Yahweh, because even Moses didn't know it. And so when he said, well, when I tell them God, they're going to say, well, which God? What's his name? What am I going to say? And God said, you use the name I am. Say, I am sent me.
They had to grow longing for God.
I give you permission.
Yeah, I want to point out that we all make guesses as to why, but if God doesn't give us the answer, let's be cautious in saying this is why.
Yeah, but we still have to keep praying.
Yes, but I'm talking about why in Exodus.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's turn to page 3. Now, if you want to refer back to your timeline, you can see that after the plagues, the 10 plagues that destroyed the most powerful nation on earth, and after the parting of the Red Sea, which a wall of water on their left and on their right. They didn't go single file, though. If that's the image I had as a kid when I read a wall on their left hand and on their right, I imagined like a hallway of water. It was not like that. The nation's left hand and the nation's right. So it was a huge division. But either way, the parting of the Red Sea was probably as or more astonishing than any of the plagues. And after that, we come to Massa and Meribah. So,
What Egypt's history says about it.
yeah, well, there's a lot of speculation about that, and there's some interesting things that are all presuming. So, Paul, could you read for us from Exodus 17, right after all these miracles? This is what we get. Exodus 17 at the top of page 3.
Down to Exodus 19.
Yeah.
The whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So they quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses replied, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why don't you put the Lord to the test?"
Wait. Read that last question again.
Why do you put the Lord to the test?
Mm-hmm.
But the people were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled against Moses. They said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst?" Then Moses cried out to the Lord, "What am I to do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me." The Lord answered Moses, "Go out in front of the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel, and he called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled and because they tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?"
Okay, so remember, whenever we see Lord in all capitals like that, very unusual to change the font size in the middle, but those are small capitals, O-R-D. That's the personal name of God, Yahweh or Jehovah. They put Lord because we don't know how to pronounce it. But Yahweh is the best guess. Jehovah is a poor guess. But again, it's a guess. Okay. So is this Yahweh God, the God of our great-great-grandfather Abraham, is he among us or not? That's their question. What's the problem with that question?
Lack of faith.
Good. Lack of faith. There's more to it, yes. They had just seen the 10 plagues and the parting of the Red Sea, and they're like, is God among us? Look at their question. Is God going to let us die of thirst? I think he's going to. Why'd you bring us out here just to let us die of thirst? Their question should have been to themselves, why would God bring us out here to let us die of thirst? Maybe he's going to take care of us. Hey, Deborah, I can just take care of that and catch you up afterwards, after class. Hey, Natalie, I'll just help her after class. That's okay. So, after these astonishing displays of power, the people still complain. Now, this little episode becomes exceedingly important in their history. Not only does it start up a pattern of what kind of people these are, who are immediately ready to turn their backs on God. But it set up a pattern, especially right after God shows himself. The next event after Massah and Meribah is Mount Sinai. So this event, remember when I said the exile was arguably the most important event in the Old Testament? It's second only to this little paragraph here. And there's pages and pages and books about the exile, and there's one paragraph about this. But this is the climax of the Old Testament. Bronwyn, could you read Exodus 19, 16 through 19?
On the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning with a thick cloud over the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. As the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him.
So the people go out into the desert on that little peninsula, and they come to Mount Sinai. So you've got, a mountain here, and you've got a camp of a couple million people here. Tens upon tens, a huge area. And they had just seen the finger of God in our world doing astonishing things. And then they complained and quarreled and said, God's going to kill us. And then, so you've got, the heavens over top of them with the stars and the clouds and all of that. And then, what did it say in the middle of 18? Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it. So God rends the heavens, and Yahweh himself comes down to the top of this mountain. God comes out of heaven down onto earth. This event is a cataclysmic event. Look what the things we have. Thunder, lightning, thick clouds over the mountains, a very loud trumpet blast. This is not like a normal trumpet blast. The people trembled. The mountain itself quakes. This is I can't think of any other word other than cataclysmic. An earth-shaking event. You've got, what else? It's covered with smoke. The Lord descended on it in fire. Smoke billowed up like smoke from a furnace. The whole mountain trembled violently. The sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder. Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. So God himself comes down to meet this people. And the people are terrified. And they don't want it. Moses, you go talk to God. We don't want to meet with God. We're scared of our God. The gods of Egypt were talked about and were, painted on the walls. But they didn't ever actually come and appear to us.
It's like the Passover would got their attention.
You'd think a lot of things would have got their attention, yes. But it's almost impossible to overstate the significance of this event. The reason this event is more significant than the exile is because the reason the exile was significant was because these people had made a covenant with God. God came out of heaven down to earth and made a covenant with the people. That's what Sinai is all about. And says, you're going to be my people and I'm going to be your God. Because the world has come to a place where everybody thinks that each nation has their own God. So I'm going to talk to them in their own language, and I'll allow myself to be thought of as the God of the Hebrews. But guess what? Everybody, and this is all laid out in Exodus, everybody is going to hear, hey, there's this one nation called the Hebrews or something, and their God is different from every other God. Their God makes them never have a drought, never have a plague, 0 of their women miscarry or die in childbirth. They go to war and they have 0 casualties. No one in the whole nation ever dies before they're old. Their God is way better than our God. So that is what God meant when he said, you were going to be a kingdom of priests for me. What is a priest? Does anyone know what the word priest means?
A leader?
No. Priests tend to be leaders. But that's not what the word means. It means a go-between. So if you go to a priest, he's going to God for you. So if you go to confession to a Catholic priest. You say, Father, forgive me for I have sinned, and you say the things you've done. It's not that he has the power to forgive sins, but he's a go-between between you and God. Like a mediator. Yes, exactly like a mediator. So when the Bible says that all believers are priests, it means we don't need a mediator. We can go to God directly because we have the mediator, Jesus Christ, who is God. Our mediator is God. So, yes. So the Jewish people, the plan for this covenant was that they would be an entire nation of priests. So that all the other nations would be like, can you talk to your God for us? Is there a way? Like, what does your God say about us joining your nation? And if you read through the Torah, the 5 books of the Bible, it's constantly saying, these laws are for you and for anyone who joins you. Don't be mean to the aliens living among you. You were aliens in Egypt. You know what that's like. Let people join this community. Eventually it's going to be the whole world. That was the plan. Of course, the Jewish people blow it over and over and over and over. Immediately after this event, so immediately after the plagues and the parting of the Red Sea, they quarrel with God and Moses want to kill Moses. Immediately after this event is the spies story. So essentially, we're running short on time, so we won't read the whole spies story. I'll just sum it up for you. Or can anyone sum it up?
He sent out, I think, 12 guys
12?
to scout the land and bring back some of the food and whatnot, and 10 of them came back.
Hold on, pause. So they're here in the desert, but they're going to a land. It's going to be what their land is now, Israel, that nation. So before they go, they send out 12 spies, and then when they come back, what happens?
10 of them said it's a wonderful land, but the people there are giants. We feel like ants compared to them. They got fortified cities. Caleb and Joshua said, no, the Lord's with us, let's go. But all the people are afraid, and they say, nah.
Yes. So 2 of them say, this is the most amazing land ever, let's go. I mean, God just came out of heaven and appeared to us and said he's going to give us this land. So let's just go take it. It's great. I mean, the grapes are so big, it takes 2 guys to carry 1 cluster of grapes. This is great. It's wonderful. God's given us an awesome land. But 10 of them are like, oh no, it's scary.
Takes a while to develop faith, I guess.
Well, yes. I mean, I don't know if I'd say a while. It just seems like some of them just didn't. Just refused to believe in God. So they believed in God because they saw him. But they refused to
Like babes in Christ.
trust in him. They were not believers. They weren't babes. They were dead.
Babes in
They were dead in their
faith in
sins.
God.
That's the key. That's one of the reasons why things happen so differently in the Old Testament. Because 75% of them were not regenerate. I mean, just think how different things would be if you're planning an event and 75% of the people coming are dead. I mean, that changes how much food you pack for your event, right? I mean, everything would be different. That's why the laws in the Old Testament are, sometimes you read them and you're like, what a very strange law. But they were dealing with a different situation. Now the church is technically 100% regenerate. It's just that there are also unregenerate people pretending to be part of the church. But we don't have time for that. So, So the people, they listened to the 10 rather than the 2. They didn't learn from, oh wait, God can defeat the most powerful nation on earth, Egypt, easily, in a matter of weeks. Maybe we can defeat these Canaanites. But again, they refused to believe. And so if you turn to the next page, that starts with chapter 14, just the green at the top. Just the green. Candy, could you read that little green section at the top of chapter 14?
Yeah, honey, all the members of the community Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, "If only we had died in Egypt, or in this wilderness. Why is God bringing us to this land, only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt?" And they said to each other, "We should choose a leader and go back to Egypt."
Okay. So, because they hear the bad report from the 10, they've already given up. Let's just go back to Egypt. In fact, we kind of like their gods better because their gods are tame. And we know what they're going to do, which is nothing. We don't know what this God's going to do. So, notice they said, if only we, had died in the wilderness. If only we had died in Egypt or in the wilderness. We'd rather die in the wilderness than go fight these guys. And our children are going to be taken as plunder. I underline those sections because God says down below, okay, you know what? You are going to die in the wilderness. And your children that you said would be taken as plunder, they're going to get to go in. But you are going to die in the wilderness. I'm going to just make you wander around for 40 years. 1 year for every day the spies were there. The spies were there 40 days. You're going to wander around for 40 years because you didn't believe that I could defeat these people.
People are like that today, too. They don't believe stuff when you tell them.
Yeah. I mean, this is a very unique situation, though, based on what had just happened. So, okay. Now, what happens next is after Exodus, the Exodus story, God gives the 10 Commandments, which is very famous, but then God also gives a bunch of other commandments. There's the 10 Commandments, which are the famous ones, but then there's a bunch of others. Can anyone name any of the other commandments besides the 10?
Like the health laws and ordinances, the
I can't-
statutes, the health. Are you
There's
talking about
anything. There's like 613.
To love your neighbor as you love yourself.
Okay, very good. Very good. Anybody name any others?
Let's see.
Don't drink blood.
Obey your parents.
Yeah.
Don't drink blood.
Don't, clean and unclean.
Yeah, if it has certain types of animals you can eat, certain types of animals you can't eat.
Don't eat pork.
Yeah, don't eat pork, don't eat lobster. It's got to be this, it's got to be that. Don't wear mixed fabrics. If you accidentally touch a dead body, you got to go outside the camp and wash and wait till sundown, then you can go back in.
And then we're never to intermarry.
Don't marry the Canaanites.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't marry the Canaanites.
Don't braid
They
your hair.
cut because they.
On a certain day of a certain month, you go in and you do this sacrifice and you pour out this and you take a piece of the muscle and you wave it before the Lord and you do this.
Don't touch a dead.
That's why they were written down, because it was hard to remember them. Yeah.
Touch a cord.
If a woman's on her period, then she has to sit in a certain chair and nobody else can sit in that chair after her. And just a whole, you're like, what? That's why if you try to read through the whole Bible, it's going great. And you get towards the end of Exodus and you're slowing down because you're like, whew, okay, weird laws. And then you get to Leviticus and you're like, okay, good, done with that. And then it's even worse. And it's just page after page of all these laws, and you're thinking, what is going on here? What's going on is they were starting a new nation. What if you read all of America's laws? It's longer than the Bible and less easy to understand. And there's no interesting stories sprinkled in. They're starting a nation, so there's a whole lot of things they have to do. They have to make laws about land and ownership and boundaries and what do you do if somebody wants to become a slave, and there's all kinds of laws because they're forming a nation and God is giving the laws. Now, God understands that not every single situation can be covered, so he gives enough various situations so that a judge who's been reading this can say, okay, this isn't covered exactly, but based on the way God handles these other things, I can tell what God would want for this. That's why Torah means law, but it also means instruction. Okay, another key concept is down at the bottom of page, 4? Is that what we're on? Sue, could you read Exodus 33:7 at the bottom of page 4?
Now Moses used to take a tent and pitch it outside the camp some distance away, calling it the tent of meeting. Anyone inquiring of the Lord would go to the tent of meeting outside the camp.
So, before Sinai, as they were a people, you wanted to meet with God, you go outside the camp, and there was a tent of meeting where God would meet with Moses and Joshua, Aaron sometimes. And then they could find out about God. But by Numbers, Lynn, could you read Numbers 2:1?
The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, the Israelites are to camp around the tent of meeting from some distance from it.
What has changed?
Well, they,
Towards meeting with
Distance.
the people.
the distance, yeah.
What's changed is that it used to be outside the camp is where God was. Now that God's made a covenant with him, he's come inside the camp in the center. He lives among them. And there's all these instructions about how to build the tabernacle and God's house, because they're all living in tents, because they're nomadic. And God's house is a tent. A really fancy tent, but a tent. So this is a huge move because there is a pattern in the Old Testament of God. He's distant, he's far away, but he appears to Abraham. He says, I'm going to make a covenant with you. There's a whole group of people. God is distant and far away and scary, and then he comes and lives in them. And then pretty soon there's going to be a temple. The God has a permanent house in their city. And then pretty soon, God comes among us in human form. And Jesus is the temple. And you can see him and touch him. And then, after Jesus ascends, God comes and lives in us. Now I'm the temple. I meet with God inside me. That's why we close our eyes when we pray. Because God is not something I need to look at. I close my eyes and go inward, because that's where I meet with God now. My body is a temple of God. It's God's house. If God was willing to live in an imperfect house like a tent for 400 years, well, luckily he's willing to live inside this imperfect tent for hopefully 70 years. So there's a pattern of God getting closer and closer to his people over the course of the history of salvation. Okay. These stories, let's turn to page 5. These stories form the foundation for the rest of the Bible. Here's an example. Let's have Paul read verse 1a, and everyone together will say his love endures forever. And we'll go on till I stop us, okay? So we all know what to say. We all say the same thing every time.
Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good.
His love endures.
Give thanks to the God of gods.
His love endures forever.
Give thanks to the Lord of lords.
His love endures forever.
To him who alone does great wonders.
His love endures forever.
Who by his understanding made the heavens.
His love endures forever.
Who spread out the earth upon the waters.
His love endures forever.
Who made the great lights.
His love endures forever.
The sun to govern the day.
His love endures forever.
The moon and stars to govern the night.
His love endures forever.
To him who struck down the firstborn of Egypt,
His love endures forever.
and brought Israel out from among them,
His love endures forever.
with a mighty hand and outstretched arm.
His love endures forever.
To him who divided the Red Sea asunder,
His love endures forever.
and brought Israel through the midst of it.
His love endures forever.
Okay, let's just stop there. It goes on all the way down to Sihon, king of the Amorites, and Og, king of Bashan. But you see how the events of the first 5 books of the Bible set up, become the foundation for the rest of the Bible. This psalm would be incomprehensible, essentially. If you're like, what? Struck down the firstborn in Egypt, that's a good thing? You go around killing firstborn babies? What? Okay, and then we have one more example. This psalm, I could spend a whole hour and 15 minutes on this psalm alone, but we won't. Let me just put it this way. The first half, the first 7 verses, is all about worship. Come, let us sing for joy to the Lord. Let us shout aloud to the rock of our salvation. Now, that's a very happy kind of worship. A peppy song, if you will. And about how great he is. And then, in verse 6, the tone changes. Pat, could you read verse 6?
Come, let us bow down and worship. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker, for he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture, the flock under his care.
Good. Notice the tone. It's not shouting and joy and singing. It's let's kneel down and bow and worship. Let's kneel. Because he's our God. He's our Maker. We are the people of his pasture, the flock under his care. There's a tenderness here. So the two genres of worship are celebratory, because God is so awesome, so powerful, and humble, because God loves me. That awesome God loves me. That's the order our worship is supposed to go in. God, in your prayer, you should move from, God, you are so great, you are so powerful, you made the universe, you're infinitely beyond the universe, you're huge. So move from that type of praise to, and yet you love me, and you care about me. Thank you. That's the mode worship should go. And then the third section, starting with today. Tom, could you read, starting with today, the rest of that chapter?
Today, if only you would hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as you did at Meribah, as you did that day at Massah in the wilderness, where your ancestors tested me. They tried me, though they had seen what I did.
Okay, pause right there. Though they had seen what I did. They saw me do the plagues. They saw me part the sea. And then they tested me. Is God really here? Is God really going to take care of us? I don't know. Let's kill Moses.
Let's go back to Egypt.
Okay, and then how does God respond to that type of disobedience? Now, start the rest of it, Tom.
For 40 years I was angry with that generation. I said, they are a people whose heart goes astray, and they have not known my ways. So I declared an oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest.
So the psalmist here is putting together those passages we read. The passage of Massah and Meribah and the passage of the spies where God says, you're not getting in. You're going to die here in the wilderness.
Makes you wonder, or makes you think about grumbling and complaining.
It does. In fact, I can't think of the reference, but there's a list of sins in these passages that are like murder, homosexuality, complaining, and you wonder, wow, these are things that God hates. And there's one of them on this list that I do multiple times a day.
What's that?
Complain.
You have nothing to complain about.
And yet we do. It's very sad. Okay. All right. So, now, the order of worship is that God's greatness and amazing, and it's awesome to, and yet God loves me and cares for me. And then from there, our response, obedience. Today, if only you would listen to him, if only you would hear his voice. Don't be like they did. They had just seen what God did, and then they disobey. They don't trust him. They tested God. I don't know if I trust this God. So, the reason our response is this kind of obedience and humility and trust here is because our worship is the ground for it. Worship leads to obedience. Awe at God leads to humility. And love of God, he takes care of me, leads to our trust. He takes care of me, so I can trust that he's going to take care of me in the future. He just protected me from all those plagues. I think he can protect me from dying of thirst. So, obviously, this psalm wouldn't make any sense without knowing the background. But knowing the background also makes more sense in our lives. This today is for every day that's called today. Hebrews talks all about this psalm, explaining why it's so important. All the things that were true during the Exodus are true now for you today. The God who came down to earth out of heaven, that's the God who said, "Oh, ye of little faith, you're worth more than many sparrows. You don't think I'm going to take care of you?"